Good morning. I think we are ready to get started. Thank you all for joining us this morning. My name is Alex Zafiroglu, and I'm a professor in the School of Cybernetics. I'm one of the co-hosts today with Seth Lazar from the School of Philosophy. We are meeting today on the lands and over the airwaves of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and on land that is always sacred and never ceded. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I also wish to acknowledge and welcome Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders who are joining us today. As we're discussing emerging technologies in artificial intelligence with Dr. Young, I also want to acknowledge that we're doing this on land where these types of conversations about our relationships in open, complex systems have been going on for millennia. So welcome to the School of Cybernetics' first public event of 2024. We're pleased to be co-hosting with the MINT Lab, and which Professor Seth Lazar will introduce shortly. In the School of Cybernetics, we are building capacity in navigating major societal transformations, drawing on the rich history of cybernetics and reimagining it for the 21st century. We are thinking about making spaces for futures that consider relationships between and among people, environments, and technologies towards outcomes that are responsible, sustainable, and safe. And with that, I want to hand over to Professor Lazar to introduce MINT and also to introduce our speaker, Dr. Meg Young.
Thank you, Alex. Hey, I'm Seth. I'm a professor in the School of Philosophy. That's where I lead the Machine Intelligence and Normative Theory Lab, i.e. MINT. Obviously, I'm also British and grew up in the 90s when MINT meant like wicked or really cool. So that's why the acronym. So we study the morality, law, and politics of data and AI. And I'm really grateful to Alex and the School of Cybernetics for hosting this event. And I'm delighted to introduce my friend Meg Young to you all. So Meg is a researcher at Data and Society, which she joined after a spell with Helen Nissenbaum's group at Cornell Tech, following a PhD at the University of Washington. She studies how to support advocacy groups and the public to drive algorithmic accountability and assessment in practice. She's collaborated with activists, advocacy groups, public agencies on capacity building for data governance, technology oversight, and public engagement, and has deep experience of trying to figure out how to implement algorithmic accountability on the ground, both with and on behalf of those who are most directly affected, through engaging and sometimes butting up against those holding the levers of power. Maybe she'll tell you some stories at some point about the New York City municipality and her engagements with them. She's published extensively in venues focused on AI and society, and has played a crucial leadership role in the FACT conference, the ACM Fairness, Accountability and Transparency Conference, both through her critical work published in the conference, but also through delivering our most successful ever level of civil society engagement in the 2023 conference that took place in Chicago. And this year she's general chair as well. So she's one of those people who has worked so well and so hard that she's ended up getting all the responsibility. So we're very grateful to her for that. She's visiting MINT and ANU for a few weeks, and she'll be available for people to chat with. I think she's got a desk upstairs, a desk over in RSSS as well. And in a couple of weeks, there's going to be a seminar, which word is going out about, for PhD students on research methods, which I encourage all PhD students to sign up for. So anyone working on anything connected with impacts of algorithmic systems and digital rights in general should get in touch with Meg and make time for a coffee, which she very much likes, so that will go down well. So with that, let's welcome Meg to talk to us about public participation in the age of foundation models.
Thank you so much, Seth. I really appreciate that introduction. And I also want to say that Alex Zafiroglu and Seth Lazar have been two absolutely incredible friends and hosts, soon to be mentor, but I'm really inspired to be on this campus because the values that are here at the Cybernetics Center of application to practice have brought all of these amazing people like yourselves into the room who have steeped themselves in practice. And I'm very committed to trying to figure out how we're going to make AI more responsive to different domains of work, like the work experience that you have here. I'm also really inspired by the work happening at Mint Lab and what Seth Lazar is leading, because he's taking all of the conceptual work of political philosophy and really bringing it to bear on down to the metal, really frontier AI, as cutting edge as it gets, putting us in contact with people that we otherwise might not get to talk to if he wasn't cultivating those relationships with the people that are developing the systems that I'll be talking about today. So huge thanks to Seth for making it possible for me to be here, and to Alex for hosting me. I'm going to be presenting work that I did with some colleagues at Cornell University, and especially Harini Suresh, who is a computer scientist who's done a lot of participatory machine learning with feminicide activists, and she's brought the technical orientation to the project, and Emily Sang, who has also steeped herself in domestic violence and intimate partner violence activism and trying to figure out how to build systems on the ground. So this is a group effort. I'm interested in how public participation will work for foundation models. I'll be explaining what both of those are, but I'm bringing you a new idea. I've never given this talk before. This is a set of problems, a problem space that I want to put in front of you, trying to figure it out. So please help me kick the tires of it, take all the experiences that you're bringing into the room, and let's get this thing right. I don't know about you, but it's been a really tiring year. It feels like being in a wave pool where every successive wave of ChatGPT is crashing down over us. We can barely catch our breath. It seems like just this morning, there was some release where you can put text into an OpenAI product and it will generate new video. Whew. So I am responding like you to this extremely unusual time that we're in. All of these technologies, whether it's ChatGPT, where you're using text, or the video tool that I just explained, or DALL-E, which you can put text in and get original art out, all of these have been described by Rishi Bomasani and colleagues as foundation models. Now, they're not the first models to use pre-training and self-supervision, but they are representing a paradigm shift where all of these different domains, whether it's medicine or health or education, can suddenly be addressed with a single kind of model, a single approach that means that one system is being deployed across many, many contexts, and you can see that here. So it's a multimodal or large language model, training on text, images, speech, billions of parameters, becoming a single foundation model that can be used for all of these different tasks, whether it's asking ChatGPT a question or trying to summarize information, many tasks we haven't even imagined what they are yet. And this means that this one model, whether it's being created by OpenAI or Meta or Google DeepMind, is the site of an enormous power asymmetry where the developers of that model are deploying it across innumerable professions and professionals who might have been involved in some way, in some kind of consultation with these companies, but they are not the ones deciding. And we don't really have that much visibility in the extent to which they were supported to shape these systems at all. And this is something that really concerns me. And moreover, it's not just going to be ChatGPT as a standalone tool. These tools are very rapidly going to be integrated into our healthcare systems. So this is Epic, which is a very popular healthcare record system in the US, but I'm sure it's happening here as well. We'll soon be working directly with OpenAI. So OpenAI software mediating our access to medical records or financial services. I'm aware of very major multinational corporations that are also working with OpenAI to explore how the foundation models can be used for a number of different applications. One that I'm going to go into later is fraud detection. So if you use your credit card, how do you make sure that it's you? If somebody steals your credit card, how do they detect it if there's fraudulence happening? Maybe LLMs, large language models, can help. Or education, and we're at a university. I don't need to say much here about the paradigm shift that's happening in education because of large language models. But this concern over what impacts the AI can have on people isn't new. It is just the latest in many well-documented risks of AI that are not unique to foundation models and to which people are already starting to respond. Raise your hand if you've heard of the participatory turn. Great, okay, so many of us are familiar with this way of approaching this power asymmetry. The basic idea is that the people who are most impacted by systems should be the ones who are helping design them or governing them, evaluating their impacts. There are many ways to do this, but this has led to an explosion of interest. It's not straightforward to do at all with AI as a design material. And it's exciting because there's just this spate of investment and work trying to look at how would we do this if we were truly committed to that idea. It's been put to many different goals, from making systems better to trying to support people's self-determination and agency over the systems that impact them. And we'll go deeper into that as well. There are also really well-documented risks that participation can just be hollow. So if I ask you for your input, but I don't give you that much meaningful say, I could go ahead and do what I wanted to do anyway and say that you've been consulted. And that's something that people have critiqued about participatory methods. In fact, this participatory turn is the reason that I have a job. So I work at Data and Society, which is a nonprofit that creates policy-facing and public-facing research in the US. And we just launched last year something called the Algorithmic Impact Methods Lab. The idea is that algorithmic impact assessments are a new policy approach that could be really effective for documenting harms for systems that are being deployed. And the people that I work with created a lab because they wanted that to be a participatory impact assessment, where you're talking to people who are going to be impacted by systems to understand what the harms are. So for any given deployment, you'd ask who's affected, what are their questions and concerns. You'd document this, and ideally, if you hit it at the right moment in the deployment, that could help shape the system or prevent harms. Now, my role is really hands-on. I'm literally contacting community groups, booking the rooms, getting the catering, facilitating the sessions. And while I'm here, supposed to write up like one of our pilot impact assessments. So the orientation that I bring to the work to you today is really practical. Like, how exactly should this work for a system like ChatGPT or its use in financial services? And also not to be overly committed to the idea that it has to be people for an advocacy group in a library room. There could be tech-based approaches where participation could be meaningful and look a lot different than what I'm used to. So if you see on this slide, I've tried to capture what some of these participatory methods could look like. This term has been applied to crowdsourcing or user research and co-design with communities. We'll talk about what some of these are, but it could be everything from doing focus groups like I just talked about, or creating data with people who the data is about. It is a vast and contested terrain of different methodological approaches. And how do we make sense of all these different methods if they're all called participatory and they're all supposed to be good? There is a long, decades-long history. How many of you have seen the ladder of citizen participation before? Okay, this is exciting. This really changed the way that I think about this entire field. And it turns out that it's all the way back in 1969. And if you get an urban planning degree, this is one of the banner topics that you learn about, that you're steeped in. Essentially, there was this policy analyst named Sherry Arnstein who was seeing public participation and public engagement in government affairs be misapplied. And she was really concerned because she thought that it was being applied to really extractive or worse, just one-way communication from the government to marginalized communities, and that it was being called robust public participation. So she came up with this heuristic for trying to determine whether people had some sort of meaningful say over the technologies that impact that, or the systems that are being deployed, the government decisions, or if it's some maybe stepping stone along the way, educating people about a new development project or pipeline, something that could support them to make more meaningful decisions in the future. And this approach, this idea that you can basically rank things from more or less participatory or meaningfully participatory, is still really relevant to AI. So my colleagues have adapted it just last year for AI, and they have called it the parameters of participation. So just like on the bottom of the ladder, you have maybe less power sharing with impacted people, and towards the top, there's more community control over the decisions that happen. They've distilled decades of work and this really common approach that you've seen again and again, not just in Arnstein's work, into something that applies to AI systems. And they found 80 papers and they sorted them along this, it's a great paper, along this heuristic, and they tried to show where there are still opportunities for us to do participation better. Especially, I'd like to draw your attention to this idea of the goal of a participation. So you could use people's input to try to improve a system, or you could try to align an AI better with people's values, their preferences, all the way to people deciding whether there should be a system at all. What is that system for? And that difference, they call the difference between consulting, including, collaborating, and owning the system. And I'll use that throughout the next section. So like I said, our question was, how do participatory methods apply to systems like ChatGPT? How is it being done right now? How could it be done? And we took a look, we did a purposive sample of all the latest cutting edge work in this vein. There really isn't very much. And we clustered it into some approaches that I'm going to describe to you what they are. And they are here to describe what's happening, the state of play. So that was everything from academic literature that we pulled and categorized to gray literature. And just as we were getting ready to publish this, something really exciting happened. Let me know if you heard about this. Did anyone else in the room follow this Democratic Inputs project from OpenAI? Cool. Y'all are reading the same stuff as me. This is an acknowledgement, essentially, that OpenAI knows that they're impacting so many professions, like I mentioned at the beginning, and they put out $100,000 grants to about 10 organizations with the idea being, how do we make this work more democratic? So to kick test the categories that I just mentioned, and we'll dig into, we even sorted those projects into the categories to follow. So the first one isn't really participation, but it's such a common way of making these huge foundation models more porous to human input that we felt like we had to mention it. And it's called reinforcement learning with human feedback. If you don't have a computer science background and you're feeling that right now, don't worry, me neither. I'm, again, the person that, holds the focus groups, but I'll just run through this at a high level. So if a system like ChatGPT is creating outputs and you are trying to steer it, for example, to be more cautious with misinformation, it could give you 4 different examples of an output in response to a question. And a human labeler would rank these from the most to the least cautious when it comes to misinformation. And then that signal would feed back into how the model is developed. This figure and all of this is really well documented, reinforcement learning with human feedback. Now, again, this isn't really participatory in the sense of the participatory tradition that I've been telling you about, but we put it through the parameters of participation anyway, and it's getting cut off a bit, but essentially because the purpose of this is to improve the performance of the system and not to empower specific communities, we put it quite low as a type of consultation. And I'll just run through the rest of these. Rule sets are much more interesting, and you might have heard about this as the constitutional AI. They are, here, let me get my notes for this. They're essentially guidelines for how the model should behave, and they could be generated a number of ways. So in this project, which was done for this AI system called Anthropic, they asked 1,000 people online using a public deliberation tool, how do you think the system should behave? So help us pick rules for our AI chatbot, vote below, and through this voting process, they derived a list of rules. Here are some examples. The AI should prioritize the needs of marginalized communities, and then they had a breakdown. So how many people felt that it should be so. The AI should not say racist or sexist things, and so on. So these rule sets can be an input to how the model behaves. It's not necessarily the case that it be generated by voting. In that last project, they found 1,000 people on the internet who represented the United States demographically. In this project by Bergman et al., it's still not published because we're really looking at the cutting edge of work in this field. They convened focus groups of marginalized people, and they put chatbot examples in front of them and said, how do you think that the system should behave in these scenarios? So they talked to a group of women or a group of Southeast Asian people, a group of Black Americans, and asked for specific guidance about how the chatbot should behave and came up with rules like this. So should not use negative language to refer to the culture or customs of a specific group of people. I know this is text heavy, but I think you get a sense for the kinds of rules that are on this rule set. And here's an example of the kind of chatbot interaction that was put in front of people. This is about the wage gap between men and women. And again, this was just an input to try to elicit what kinds of rules there should be for people who are going to be using the chatbot. So these have also been called constitutions, and these can also be used as usually it's reinforcement learning with AI feedback. These can be an input into the AI development in order to steer its behavior. But because you're only talking to people one time, and because it's really rather atomizing that you'd be asked as an individual to produce a general guideline about a general chatbot scenario, my colleagues and I have decided that this is more akin to something between a consultation or include, because you're asking to help steer the model according to people's preferences, rather than asking what should the model be used for. And I think that was probably the most interesting one. We'll just run through the rest. Red teaming, raise your hand if you've heard of red teaming. Yes, so much more commonly known, an attempt to make the system misbehave. This too can be participatory because you can imagine getting groups from all over the world or all different kinds of identities together to get the system to misbehave for your specific group. We also thought that this was something akin to consulting or including for similar reasons. So what's going on? My colleagues and I argue that there is a participatory ceiling. What do we mean by that? We think that to have meaningful participation, for you to give more weighty input into how a system should work or should behave, that it needs to be grounded in a context of use, in a task where the system is happening, is being deployed. And foundation models, by their very nature, like we talked about at the beginning, are being developed universally to be applied across many different settings. And so these attempts to try to bring people in to participate in the foundation itself end up being diluted across an enormous sea of different contexts that the model could be deployed across, and it makes it more difficult for people to have a meaningful say. We think that the examples that I just put in front of you end up mostly, and not trying to make a totalizing claim, but mostly are asking about hypothetical or abstract scenarios. And I put this cliff face because there's nothing really you can grab onto. It's really hard to actually make progress against such a surface. And I'm also thinking about how if there's a single model that's deployed across settings, that any specific stakeholder group has very little standing when compared to all the other stakeholders that might also be harmed or also have concerns. So how do you assert yourself across this set of interests? But keen viewers might have seen that there are some exceptions that break through the ceiling. What is going on here? So in the Democratic Inputs program, there were a few projects that were really steeped in a specific domain, where you'd, for example, have stakeholders demand pay for the data that the system is using. So this is a really neat project called Ubuntu AI. If you'd like to look it up, some of this is being cut off, but Naya Barre and Ron Eklash, Ubuntu AI will produce it right away. It's a way that artists are imagining having more rights over their data and pooling their money and having a lottery in order to support artists' interests with their data. So we think this pushes through the participatory ceiling in a really interesting way, in a way that we'd like to pull that thread and draw out and think about what could that mean for public participation on ChatGPT, what kinds of additional infrastructure might be necessary, why does this matter? Unlike that sheer rock face where there was really little to grab onto, to respond to, public participation in foundation models could instead have context specificity. So if I'm asking you about a specific task or scenario, and you are an impacted member whose rights are very clear with respect to that scenario, that gives something really much more tractable for the application of participatory methods. And it acknowledges the expertise of specific stakeholders, whether it's experts or members of an advocacy group that protect the interests of a specific situated group of people, and recognizes the value of their input, not just atomizing or universalizing as one in numerous interchangeable others. And this context can also make it much clearer who's harmed. If we want to design systems that are averting harm, that are designing in response to the concerns that people raise, we need to be really clear about who would be impacted and why. So we have picked up the foundation model nomenclature as a metaphor. We went and we ran with it. We went crazy. We got blueprint of flying around, and we're pulling up carpentry cross sections, and landed on the idea of the subfloor as a way to mediate the conversation between what's happening on the foundation layer and what's happening more on the surface or in the application layer. So today, you will see that there is already participation happening with different groups at a surface layer, but every single time that, let's say, the ACLU, which is the Civil Liberties Organization in the United States, is contacted, it can be contacted by Google, separately from Meta, separately from OpenAI, and so on. And there's a lot of stakeholder fatigue happening. So if you drop down to the subfloor layer, where there could be domain-specific infrastructure, both technical and policy, that adheres across a given domain, that organization could be consulted once, and it could apply across a domain in which the foundation models are being used. And I'll give you some examples. So the first case study is in clinical care. We're already starting to see that when patients are going to their doctors and they're telling about their ailments, there are pilots to have automated systems listening in order to take the keyboard out from between you and your provider and automatically transcribe the interaction and summarize that information to be useful for medical records and medical notes. The LLMs that are doing that are very likely to have different kinds of equity concerns. So what if a person is code switching between their first language and their second language? What if a person has an accent and the LLM is failing disparately for certain groups of people over others? What about the really well-documented concerns with how different patients are treated with respect to pain management? So we imagine that rather than deploying LLMs into this clinical encounter and then having to fix these problems anew, consulting each relevant stakeholder group and really reinventing the wheel, that there could be a subfloor layer at the level of a hospital consortium that would be fine-tuned model that's very attentive to the risks that I just shared with you, and is responsible for trying to remediate vis-a-vis those concerns. If participation happened at the subfloor layer, then different patient advocacy groups could raise their concerns, and that those could be reflected in robust use policies that would then adhere across all of the settings where this model is being used, instead of each hospital having to fend for itself in taking this foundation model and trying to finish the job of what the original model provider was not able to be responsive to. And the hospital is also much more likely to listen to people's concerns, because unlike interests having to vie against many other equally concerning harms, the hospital scopes those harms, the subfloor scopes those harms so that people are more likely to be heard. Okay, so another place that this is actually happening, and we talked to people in financial services, is, like I mentioned, fraud detection. Today, they are already starting to explore how large language models could be applied to your credit card transactions to identify fraud in order to save you money on a macro sense, or really save the credit card companies money from fraud detection. However, these are very stochastic systems that are picking up on minute signals that we're not necessarily aware of now and are unlikely to notice until they're deployed at scale. there could be really grave equity concerns there as well. In this case, you could have the subfloor hosted in a standards body. There's already one that works for the financial services sector called the PCI, the Payment Consortium. We can check, but it's a place where standards are issued for cybersecurity and for the hardware of your credit cards. And all of the different providers in that domain already have to be responsive to what the PCI standards dictate. So if that group had advisory groups that rolled up into it with really robust grassroots ties, you could imagine an early warning system or people raising their concerns about fraud detection going wrong in order to make their concerns known and remediated. And instead of Visa and MasterCard and all the largest banks having to do this duplicatively for every concerned group, this uptake could happen at the domain level and adhere across the system. And finally, and this one is quite close to home, I don't know if you've seen, but New York Times is already suing OpenAI for copyright violation. And there was a union in the United States, the Writers Guild of America, that was very successful in pressing on this same issue to protect their rights as creators. But in this case, journalists are already starting to feel the labor impacts of LLMs replacing them in the workforce. And there are many writers' outputs that are being used as data into LLMs without attribution or credit or payment. So in this case, a subfloor could be hosted in Publishers Guild or a union, any collective action organization to have everyone group their data that would be intellectual property protected, to assert their rights, and to argue that it must be licensed for the LLM provider to be able to use it. And that organization could help administer the agreement and make sure that writers get paid. So just wrapping up, what are the virtues of this approach? I think that it's a good way for people who want to see the system work and to not have their own users or customers or community members be harmed, to have those organizations have more responsibility for the system itself, for the development of the system, for the use policies that adhere to the system, and that the people who are impacted actually are given the opportunity to shape how the system will be deployed in a way that isn't possible today. If you think about trying to elevate your concerns to OpenAI for ChatGPT, for example. And I mentioned this duplicative request risk and the burnout that's already happening. This helps to avoid that by focusing some of that energy into an organization where that consultation can happen once. It's much more high impact. As a person being consulted, you would know that there would be more uptake across a wider sphere of action. And big players like the New York Times that I just mentioned could actually help smaller players also have their rights protected instead of a piecemeal approach. However, there are still risks. There might just be another scale at which we are reproducing this power asymmetry or the structural harm by creating a new actor that people would have to address their concerns to. And that participation washing that I mentioned at the beginning is still a real possibility, even if you do try to drill down into a specific domain. It also changes who becomes liable for the harms that we're talking about in ways that are not straightforward. In the financial services case, we were told that you couldn't have a fine-tuned model for financial services because there are too many contractual relationships that adhere between the parties that assume responsibility for the functioning of the foundation model. So really just escalating concerns and risks for each company to take care of itself is a way to get around that. We've also had a lot of conversations on our team about how much this might enable bad actors to have their own subfloor that they could evade the protections that companies like OpenAI are putting in for hate speech, for example. But just to conclude, I will stand by the idea that it is very challenging to make foundation models tractable for participatory methods, for the kind of work that I care very much about, and that in order to make progress on this, that it will be important to try to find a way to ground these conversations in specific domains, in specific tasks and impacted communities. And our suggestion for this is to have a subfloor. Thank you.
Let's take the microphone just for a second. Thank you so much, Meg. Let you get a drink of water. Fantastic talk. We wanted to open it up for questions, and I wanted to put a few parameters around what constitutes a question. A question is relatively short, and it has an upward intonation at the end. It is not an exegesis on your personal views on a topic that goes on forever and ends with a declarative statement, and then might be followed by, what do you think? Because that is both a leading question and actually not a question. So with that said, I hope I haven't scared people out of asking questions, but we wanted to open up the floor to questions. We also have a few people online, so I will be calling on Pallavi as needed. And Mike is there.
I'm interested in the difference between a sort of more measured approach which you've put in and the tensions that I see with the speed of development, because I've worked in human-centered design for a very long time, and quite often the people who need to be consulted can't keep pace with the present and the acceleration. So comment on that, please, the speed and how we mitigate it.
That's such a great question. I'd love to know your name too and where you hail from on campus.
Dr. Wendy Elford. I do complex adaptive systems and in human factors, and it's always messy.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. It's so nice to meet you. I agree. The pace is really incommensurate with the slow organizational scale changes that I'm suggesting. But I think that slowness could be really beneficial for asking these organizations, whether it's our banks, our physicians, to really carefully evaluate what the value add is of an LLM over traditional machine learning when it comes to all of the use cases that are being suggested. So I wouldn't argue at all that an LLM has so many performance gains for summarizing information, or I'm sure for the fraud detection case that it could identify many that I don't think would be identified today. But we need to be very concrete about how much of a change that is, how big that delta is, before we decide to assume the risk of integrating LLMs into so many basic services when the risk mitigation strategies used for foundation models are so different and so much more poorly developed than traditional machine learning strategies. So that risk analysis will be slower, but I think that it's not impossible because of the concerns that hospitals and financial services companies have for their reputations and for public trust.
Thanks, Meg. That was amazing. I'm Sina. Maybe I know you, but I'm professor of philosophy and computer science, Northeastern University. So I really like the study of ceiling. I wanted to ask you about the issues about identity and diversity that the Delgado framework does not really discusses that much. So in all of these cases, people come from very different backgrounds, sociocultural expertise background, and different cases, different types of background can be relevant. And in red teaming, every other thing we've seen that there's quite a bit of disagreement between people. So do you have thoughts on how we incorporate these questions of identity and diversity in who we sample to include, as well as how we deal with these disagreements, whose opinion we actually weigh more? Is that in the subfloor, and how?
Thank you, Sina. That's such an important question. So I think that the subfloor doesn't conclusively solve the problems that you're raising, but it helps us make progress against what the foundation layer affords right now. Right now, in order to move forward on the questions that you're raising, there are some who would say that there should be a different foundation model deployed for differently situated stakeholder groups. That even came up in one of the papers that I mentioned, this question of whether people who are concerned about gender-based violence would have their own foundation model, and that people who come from the Southeast Asian experience would have their own foundation model. And that starts to really pull away from the power and the reason why we would have these powerful models in the first place. So at a subfloor layer, I think that it's possible to be much more concrete about whose interests are being represented and by what process, and to make those known and visible to end users in a way that can help people make a determination as to whether they feel reflected in that process, and if the people that are standing in for them in these participatory engagements represent their interests or not. And that goes in a way to some of the questions that you're raising without completely dispatching with them, because no group will ever totally represent my interests. I can only decide under what contexts and situations that would be satisfying for me in that moment. Thank you.
We have a question online.
Sure.
So this is from Kathy Reed, who's a PhD candidate working with speech foundation models. And Kathy's question is, does the proposal for a subfloor move the burden for participation even more to add advisory groups and standards bodies and away from foundation model producers? For example, if they have to create and maintain the structures needed for subfloors.
Kathy, thanks for your question. I've been excited to check in with you about the dialects piece of the work that we presented vis-a-vis your work, but I think that this idea of letting foundation model developers off the hook is a really important one, and one that we can hold in mind while also trying to cede some of the ultimate control over the systems that impact us to other more legitimate actors who would have the ability to determine what kinds of design decisions are important. And one thing I didn't have time to go into fully is the idea of connectivity from the subfloor back into the foundation model. But if the foundation model acts as a kind of floor, the way that ChatGPT does today, if you think about fine-tuning, you're not going to be able to get past the controls that OpenAI has already put in place. It will be more tractable for a hospital system, to a consortium, to escalate their concerns and to say that OpenAI needs to make these specific changes than it would be for one actor or one organization to do it. And so there could be more of a collaboration rather than an adversarial relationship, or one of completely ceding responsibility, wherein groups of organizations together can escalate certain concerns that together, because of their purchasing power, become much more relevant for a large company to deal with than they are under the current system. Thank you. Actually, someone from that.
Hi, I'm Ned Cooper. I'm a PhD student here at ANU. I was looking forward to your presentation for a while now, so really good presentation. I was interested in your perspective on the role of academics in this participatory turn. Like, how do we kind of balance studying systems and social change with acting in support of participant interests in the studies we do? I
think that's an important question. Thank you so much, Ned. I I was just reading back to this Bomasani paper. If you all found this interesting and you'd like to go back to the Bomasani risks and opportunities of foundation models, turns out that it's 150 pages and terrific to read. It's much more delightful than it should be for the topic, but they're talking about how academics have a unique responsibility because of the ways that we are already working, especially in places like Mint Lab or Cybernetics Center, the interdisciplinary skill sets that we have to bring to bear on these problems gives us a huge responsibility in this conversation, especially because it seems to me that industry is still trying to catch up with some of the vibrance of the interdisciplinary conversations that are happening in academia, but industry happens to have the access to product and they are trying to still figure out how to put together their cross-functional teams and we have less reach into that. So the other part of your question was about how do we, what's the responsibility that we have for representing other stakeholders or somehow bringing them in. And I think that wherever possible, if we can try to reconfigure our institutions and the ways that money is dispensed and relationships with impacted communities are cultivated so that we can be doing proofs of concept to show how this might work in maybe less sophisticated ML development projects so that those proofs of concept exist for industry to refer to when they're trying to think about how should participation look on the other side of the proprietary fence. So that's how I think about it. Thank you, Ned. Oh, okay. Seth and Ben here, is that fine? Were you hopping on it? Okay.
I think this is, yes.
So I really like this, and I think that, you know, one of the ways in which foundation models do have a lot of potential is that they are so customizable. But I was thinking a lot about how you kind of, what the theory of change is here, how you get people to actually do this. Especially this struck me when you were talking about the hospitals, because as far as I understand in the US, like hospitals are not like the nicest organizations, and they're not necessarily acting in their patients' best interests. Just one thing I wanted to ask if you thought of was how this might connect with, you know, sort of enterprise bargaining, unions, that sort of thing. Like it seems to me as though, like for us in universities, one thing to think about is like, how could we kind of take this sort of subfloor approach, make sure that any AI tools that are deployed in universities for education are actually ones that kind of have union approval? Like what other mechanisms do you see for actually enabling, sort of forcing the subfloor to come about in the ways that you're describing?
Thanks for that question, Seth. Yes, this does relate to Ned's point that in universities, we can use the unions, if we happen to be lucky enough to be a part of one, to try to collectively act. I didn't get to pull out the Writers Guild of America example enough, but it is akin to a subfloor in that in the United States, which is a very labor hostile context, people went on strike long enough in order to assert that they had rights over how AI would impact their work. They were able to get to an agreement that AI shouldn't be able to displace the work that they're doing, or that if they're handed any AI work products, that they should be able to, that they should have full transparency around that. And so that really speaks to the promise of the approach that you're advocating for, Seth, and that we've already seen that it works. We've seen that it's possible. And I agree with what you said about the hospitals, that it is more likely that if we start with organized labor, that those interests could be better aligned for patients' needs or for workers' needs than the way that hospitals' interests are currently constituted, which tend to and are already usually promoting questions of billing and efficiency, which isn't quite what we'd like to see come out of the subfloor issue. So as far as other paths forward, one of the things that I like about the subfloor approach is that it can hook onto any number of conceivable existing organizational configurations. And so even within the level of the Cybernetics Center or ANU, you could start to imagine collectively governing a fine-tuned model to the ends that you'd like, and maybe that model could be seeded and propagate outward. Thank you. I saw questions over here. I'll start. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks for your presentation, Meg. My name's Lorraine Ruster. I'm a PhD student here at the School of Cybernetics. So looking forward to our future session with you. I'm curious about this role of the subfloor in, it seems to me there's a lot of focus on mitigating risks, protections, guardrails, and sort of preventing harm. And I'm curious, when you talk about impact, it sort of seems to be in that mode, but I'm curious around what role the subfloor or other things that you're doing are playing in more like a proactive space of not just like protecting bad things from happening, but also like promoting a positive pro-social, proactive interest, if that makes sense.
It really makes sense. Thank you, Lauren. I think you've picked up on something that's very inextricable from my way into the problem, which is that on a day-to-day, we're thinking about impact assessments and harm, and you're absolutely right that it feels kind of like I'm a second-gen AI person, and that your question is coming more from like a next-gen, envisioning the future, trying to step into the worlds that we want to inhabit, and I really appreciate that. I think that one direction to start to think with could be, I've talked to a lot of artists who do use AI as one of the inputs in their process. And so you could imagine artists in an organization having a version of an LLM that they feel good about. What if they contributed the data themselves and then used something called a retrieval augmented, what is it called? Exactly. You could somehow close in the problem space to only the data that you contributed, that you have licensed, but still have the benefit of the powerful AI working within that space. And then maybe artists would feel more comfortable using foundation models in their process because they were using something that was collectively controlled. So these are the kinds of directions that I start to think in, and I really appreciate the question.
I think we have time for one more question. Or, sorry. We're also going to have tea afterwards, so we can continue the conversation after that, but we're going to wrap after this last question.
Hi, I'm Louisa. I work on history of technology here at the ANU. I was just wondering if you could maybe talk about the kind of economic incentives that underlie AI adoption and how that figures into, for example, like adoption by public services versus kind of adoption by like the private sector, such as the banking sector. When you were talking about the healthcare example, I was thinking about the NHS and the kind of recent adoption of the Palantir system, which is kind of like an off-the-shelf system, and they're having all sorts of trouble with like, data ingestion. So I'm just wondering, like, how would that get played out if we were to adopt these kinds of like subfloor, like very well-tweaked models? And like, how would public services, which are already very cash strapped, how would that, how would they be able to kind of push for that in a way? Thanks.
Thanks for your question, Louisa. One of our original case studies was much more in contact with the municipal government world that I mostly do my work in. And we pulled it in part for reasons similar to what you're picking up on, which is that perhaps it's the case that LLMs are a Ferrari engine on a tractor, trailer. Like, you don't necessarily need to have these powerful models in everyday cash-strapped settings, or that we should at least be skeptical about their rollout into every sphere of life, especially when their outputs can be much more inscrutable. And like Sina's talked about recently in some work that he presented, that if a less accurate model could do the job but is more interpretable, then that actually might be the preferable choice in that setting. So I think that I agree with you that this might make more sense for settings where LLM adoption is a foregone conclusion, and for people to sort of wrest control back in a very asymmetrical set of circumstances when it comes to the model design. And in those where LLMs are not already deployed, I wouldn't say that this is necessarily the right path forward if a traditional or more modest model will do the job. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, so much. And thank you especially to Meg for the wonderful talk today.